This is the Living Youth Podcast. We're recording this afternoon, Thursday, June 23rd, and I'm here with my podcast partner, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. Good afternoon, Mr. Smith.
Good afternoon, Mr. Robinson.
This afternoon, we are going to talk all about the Council of Elders.
Let's do it.
Thank you once again, Jake and Julia. Always appreciate the fine jingle you've created as our bumper music.
Indeed.
Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, today's Thursday, which means that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you met with all the other members of the Council of Elders and had the first in-person meeting of the Council of Elders in over 2 years.
We did.
How was it seeing the men in the flesh again, as it were?
It was wonderful, frankly. In fact, before I go into that, let me just thank you, Mr. Robinson, for this topic. Mr. Robinson mentioned to me, I wasn't very long ago, I don't know if it was today, but earlier, but we've been thinking about the topic for this week, and he suggested, with the council having just met, maybe it'd be great to talk about that and kind of help the teens and young adults out there and families listening to kind of open up the curtains, so to speak, and talk about what it is. And anyway, I appreciate it, Mr. Robinson. Thank you very much for even thinking of this topic. If for any reason I had to do very little prep, Mr. Robinson did all the work, and I just get to sit in the seat and answer some questions.
Well, it was possibly the only way we were going to get that article finished, Mr. Smith.
But you asked about what it was like, because it was very nice. You know, it's such a privilege to be asked to serve on the council, and you get to love all those guys. They're brothers, right? Of course, in the ministry, we all feel like brothers, but boy, in that room, you spend so much time together in that room talking about things we're all really struggling together because you care for the church and serving the church. So it was hard. We've been having video conferencing for, I guess, about a couple years. Really nothing we could control over. You had men who could not leave their country, or if they left their country, they didn't know if they'd be able to get back in. Various restrictions. We had, at least, this isn't a council circumstance, but someone on the council, Mr. Rob Tyler, I remember one case he left his state part of his country and couldn't get back home in terms of the changes in regulations. You know, his wife's on the other side. It's a real difficulty, but thankfully things have loosened up enough that we were finally able to get back together again. So got the band back together again, yes, Mr. Robinson. Yes. It really was a privilege just to get to see everybody in the flesh and be able to shake hands and see each other eye to eye and spend, because part of the time you enjoy on the council, and is profitable time, is not just the time you're actually in session, but you're eating lunch together. Right. You're able to spend some time outside of those meetings together, and it really is helpful.
Well, as effective as the WebEx meetings are, I mean, you can have a very effective one. You share your screen. I mean, there are some advantages to it, but you're right. I mean, you really can't beat really being in the room with people and making, small talk here and there when you have time. I just getting to know each other again. And so one of the things I thought that would be interesting for our listeners is maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like being on the council. Like, what does the average council member do, and what's your responsibility, and how long have you personally been on the council?
Wow, let's see. I am not 100% sure how long I've been on the council. I know I've got notes going back to 2012. So Dr. Meredith asked me to be on the council. Actually, asked several of us at that time. He fresh blood or fresh meat, whatever you might think of it, but he wanted to add us to the council, and at that time. And it is a privilege. I'm sure we'll go into more details as the discussion goes on and whatever questions that you have coming up. But it does feel like a privilege in the sense that, well, I remember not being on the council in the past as a member in the congregation, and you'd hear about a council meeting, and you'd pray about the council meeting, and you know that the men there are striving to follow God's guidance to serve Mr. Weston on the council. Well, at the time it was Mr. Meredith before I was on, and striving to serve the church, to make decisions that we need made, right? The organization doesn't go forward without decisions being made, and trying to provide that counsel. and you have a picture in your mind of what you hope the council is like. You really don't know, but you know what you hope it's like. And then to be on the council and find out that it is like what you hoped it would be, you know, in terms of biblical principles. And I'll go off and I won't go into some details because we've talked a bit about the questions you're going to ask to give me a bit of a preview. So we'll probably go into more details. But it really is nice. It's very serious in the sense that there's serious things to discuss. Sometimes we sort of get papers ahead of time that maybe other people have submitted, maybe members or elders or someone have kind of submitted to be reviewed that have kind of made their way up, and Mr. Weston wants a broader look at some things.
Have you submitted one yourself?
I have submitted a few papers, not a whole lot. Because when you're busy writing other things, it's hard to put together a paper. But I actually have submitted a paper or two. It's been nice.
I would imagine that if one is writing a paper for the Council of Elders, you probably feel like you really need to be on point.
Well, you know, that's one of the great things about the council. It reminds me, frankly, also of even giving sermons and messages here at headquarters. When you're out in the field, you get feedback from members, and you know sometimes people appreciate it, sometimes they highlight something that could have been better. But you know, you give a sermon here at headquarters, you'll have Mr. Ames ready to say, "Oh, that was wonderful, thank you. You know what you could have done better," you know, and they'll let you know things you could improve. Same thing here. You're working with peers, you're working with people that frankly have been in the church for decades and decades, and not just been in the church, but striving to lead God's people for decades, and having been in the Bible for decades. And there's such an accumulated wisdom amongst those men that I appreciate so much, that really, if you're going to air out any kind of ideas or thoughts, that's the group you want to air it out to, so they can give you the feedback based on their vast amount of experience. And much like Spokesman Club, for those who we have listeners who may have experienced Spokesman Club, if you're old enough, they're also kind enough to give you feedback without stepping on you or squashing you, right? It's there's a care for each other, but at the same time there's a real plainness too, because you're talking about important things, and so you don't worry so much about not hurting somebody's feelings. But at the same time, it's easier not to hurt anyone's feelings when you're in that kind of culture where you feel like you're really surrounded by brothers who care about getting things right, but also care about each other, and they're very invested in each other.
So what would you say to somebody who maybe, as you're traveling to an outside area and speaking, who would ask you, what is the purpose of the Council of Elders? So for example, like, if you haven't thought about it too much, I probably even held an idea like this when I was younger. Why couldn't Mr. Weston or whomever is the leader of the church have a couple of really trusted advisors that he leans on a lot, and that they could discuss these ideas and the topics that you discussed in the meeting? Why couldn't just a couple of people serve the same function? Why do you need a group of men that's 12, 15 meeting to discuss these topics?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And there's no quote unquote magic number necessarily. The presiding evangelist just simply brings people on the council at his discretion that he feels will be helpful.
Well, I think in the church we always like the symmetry of 7 or 12.
That's true. That's true. And that's actually, I guess, one thing I should mention now that you've mentioned that. I appreciate it. It's not like trying to meet a magic number, right? But it really is just a matter of now, when I say presiding evangelist, the existence of a council of elders goes back to Herbert W. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong also gathered around him men that he wanted to discuss things with regularly. And why would you do that? To answer your question, because you're right, you could just have just a couple of advisors perhaps, but the Bible does emphasize the benefit of a multitude of counsel. And we know that this podcast is for our teens and youth, and we encourage you to get a multitude of counsel about things and seek out those that you may not agree with you, but at the same time who have earned your trust and your even admiration in some cases because of the wisdom you've seen in their lives. And that's another benefit to having all those voices. And Mr. Weston has said it many a time. If everybody would always give exactly the same advice, why would you even need a council, right? If you all already think in absolute lockstep about every single detail of life, well, then you've kind of assembled a group of people where you're not benefiting from other perspectives, benefiting from other experiences. You look at the council and you see people that have been all over the world. They've spent decades in various countries around the earth. They've been a part of the church through some of the church's most difficult times and some of its easiest times. And, as a result from all those different perspectives and different focuses of study and different experiences, then you really get a good variety. And the whole point of the council, just so you know, Mr. Robinson, in case there's any curiosity, we don't vote in the sense of, hey, well, let's take a vote to see what the solution to this is. And everybody raised their hand. I remember once seeing I can't even remember where it was in detail. I remember seeing something someone said on the internet that, I hear the council is voting about this or that, and the votes are really close, whatever it was. And I remember thinking, Dr. Meredith was still alive then, and I remember thinking to myself, well, is Dr. Meredith taking votes when I sneak out to go to the bathroom? Is that what's going on? Because we do not. There's no majority counting. It's not a democracy. The purpose of the council there is we advise Mr. Weston. And so we serve at his discretion, and he does not populate it with yes men. Just like Dr. Meredith, the way I try to put it is, the men on the council, they're not yes men. That is, they're going to give their opinions, and those opinions may be really different from what Mr. Weston might expect, like it was for Dr. Meredith. But when a decision is made, we are yes sir men, because we recognize this is how God works in the church, and then we're going to make sure we make those things work. So the benefit of a council, I believe, is a lot of perspective. You've got regional pastors from various areas. You've got people that run wildly different departments here at headquarters. You've got church administration, the business office, in my case, editorial, and Mr. Ames's case, of course, a vast amount of experience, but also all of media and everything that he's done. And you bring those together, and in an atmosphere of collegiality and real brotherhood, I would say, and a dedication to what the Bible tells us to do, we're able to find, hopefully, Mr. Weston finds some useful counsel for him to make the difficult decisions he has to make from time to time.
Listening to you discuss that reminded me of a couple of different things. One of them, for example, is I've read his book and I've listened to his podcast, but retired Navy SEAL Commander Jocko Willink, he finds he actually has to address this assumption that's out there with some, that Navy SEALs are almost like mindless automatons that are just machines that just do whatever they're told. And he's like, give me a break. He goes, these are the most hot-headed, egotistical, difficult people to work with, but that's what makes them great SEALs. And through the training and forming these teams, they learned how to harness that and start working together. In fact, when I watched a documentary one time on their training, their process will actually begin to weed out people who are truly not team players or can't conform to being a team player. At the end of the day, they are truly team players, and when a decision's made by the ranking officer, they join in lockstep, as it were, and go and complete the mission exactly as ordered. Like, there's a time to voice your opinion on how something should be done, and then there's a time when it's been decided and you just need to support the decision. At least in terms of listening to you talk about the Council of Elders, to hear would you say Acts 15? There was a spirited discussion.
Yeah, Mr. Weston will bring that up a lot. Because part of course what you do is you've all got your Bibles with you. Of course, some of us, they're on laptops. They're not actually printed Bibles, because I like looking stuff up real fast. I want to find my scripture real fast and contribute. And so I use my laptop Bible a lot. But everybody's got their Bibles out because you're all seeking together God's understanding and God's mind and God's solution. But yeah, that's your example about being a team in terms of the military is a good example. And Mr. Weston will often mention Acts 15. Acts 15 was a conference of ministers, leading ministers there in Jerusalem, trying to decide the issue of circumcision. Do the Gentiles need to be circumcised or not? And if you really read that carefully, especially when you know what a passionate subject it was, there was a lot of passionate testimony, argumentation, trying to understand what this was. And we know it was contentious because even after that, you did have those who would split off, those who were resisting the decision, saying, hey, look, you guys got to be circumcised. I don't care what Paul says. I don't care what Peter says. I don't care what, Jerusalem says. You guys got to be circumcised to be a part of Israel. And so that was something that the church would have to wrestle with. But what you see there are passionate people coming together so that God could make his decision known with them. And then when that decision is made, that is the decision. They were all there. I would even assume of the people who were trying to press circumcision, at least some of them were surely thinking of the Bible and trying to say, well, I don't know, hey, I heard Paul over there say that, it's not circumcision or uncircumcision, it's keeping the commandments that matter. But at the same time, isn't that a command? Aren't we commanded to be circumcising? So I imagine it was very spirited discussion, because you have people like what we are, very passionate about understanding the truth. And at the same time, recognizing God is a God who does things decently and in order. It is not an every man for himself world. It is not the time of the judges. It is a time in which God has given the church a government. And so we advise, we put our passions into it, we talk about it, and Mr. Weston presides over that. And if it doesn't seem like, God is leading us to a conclusion at that time, sometimes things get put off. But at the same time, sometimes decisions are made about things. And it's invigorating, frankly. It's exciting to be able to be in an environment like that where you feel just really open to be able to share your thoughts and to discuss things amongst a group of people where there's so much respect, frankly, and there's so much concern for others. And I really appreciate it. So that's, you'd asked way back what it's like being a part of the council. I guess that kind of helps contribute to that picture. You have a lot of people that have been asked there for their opinions and understanding concerning what the Bible says, because sometimes something might seem just like a plain old policy, and yet the Bible has principles for living, and so you want someone that you just don't want some technical expert about something. You want someone that cares about what the Bible says.
So then in that vein, what kind of topics are discussed?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, let me just kind of describe in general what the meetings are. Usually they're 3 meetings when we meet in person. When they were online, we just thought, boy, that would be a terrible meeting for 3 whole days online. I think all of our hind ends would fall asleep and we'd all never want to see our computers again. But now that we're back in person again, we did for 3 days, and it's just generally kind of a pattern. It's really up to what the presiding evangelist wants. I mean, there's sometimes Dr. Meredith would say from the beginning, hey, rather than the regular stuff, here's what I want to talk about, and he'd have something on his mind. Mr. Weston, the same thing. We're counting on and praying for his guidance in that regard. But in general, what you can expect to talk about is we'll report on various areas of responsibility to make sure we're all aware of what's going on. You have regional pastors who will talk about what's going on in their regions, any great news, but also any kind of concerns, things they might want to let us know is on the horizon, because especially from all over the world, you've got things that other people could see on the way, right? It's good to warn the rest that, hey, here's something I kind of see coming in from some area. Those who have different responsibilities in terms of the administration of the work, in terms here of headquarters, of course, Dr. Winnale, running church administration, Mr. Ames commenting on so many things because he's involved with so much, different ones. You have Mr. Wakefield, I would talk about maybe editorial projects if we take the time to talk about all the different things, because we'll want to move on to a variety of different kind of things. Sometimes it's just, just sort of mundane, practical things, right? Mr. Weston has to make so many decisions, and they can be large decisions, and sometimes they're expensive decisions, and we take God's money really seriously. And so Mr. Weston, sometimes, he'll talk to some of us at lunch during the regular weekly course here at headquarters, but every once in a while a decision is just large enough that he says, I'd like to save this for to just talk about with the council. I'd like to broaden the advice coming in. So sometimes they're very mundane things in terms that are necessary for the practical working of the church. We do have doctrinal questions come in. Sometimes a local pastor or someone, maybe a question has come up. Maybe it's something brand new the church has never seen before, because life constantly changes. Social media didn't exist X years ago. So there's new kinds of questions that come up, and so sometimes someone might submit a paper of some sort, and that finds its way through the local pastor or the regional pastor. Sometimes there's just policy things. It's one thing to have a doctrine, like consider the Sabbath. We rest on the Sabbath, right? We seek God from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, and we remember it and keep it holy. Well, to use, it's kind of a worn example, but part of it because it's such a good example. How do you actually make that happen when you have people all over the globe, right? Where do you decide, well, do we respect the international date line, or do you actually go someplace? You have to make some decisions about things just for the orderly functioning of the church, where, it's not anything new. It's something we've done for a long time, but maybe there's some new aspect to it that you've got to be able to decide for the church to be able to continue functioning. So mainly it's a lot of discussions like that, and certainly things about the work. You have lots of ideas about how to do the work better, or how to improve something we're already doing, or maybe the thoughts about some part of it that's not as going as well as it should. And I should say that actually dominates a good bit of discussion, because the Living Church of God is very focused on doing God's work. So that's often a driving concern, is what is going, like I would say, for instance, what we're talked about a lot recently was all the challenges out there, regulatory challenges, where so much of the truth is so unpopular that you have a cancellation of channels. You have there's a certain sort of barriers being put up in media, where we don't want you to say this on YouTube. We don't want this to go out. We have whole countries where it might even, like, for instance, there are countries where, let's say Muslim-dominated countries, sometimes you can have a circumstance where you try to actively convert someone who is Muslim to Christianity, and that is straight up illegal, right? So, what do you do in situations like that? The work drives all of us, and so we talk about TWPs, how to make them more effective. How do we handle these circumstances? How do we use the internet that much more effectively? What's going on? So that also is a big part of discussion. So honestly, I would say probably what we talk about is what a lot of folks think that we would talk about. Anything that you might think the presiding evangelist would want advice on, most likely makes its way into the discussion.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the purposes of podcasting about this today was to, shed a little light on what gets discussed and what goes on in the Council of Elders.
Yeah, kind of a behind the scenes, and kind of let people know, right?
But I think maybe I even felt this way a little bit when I was younger, that there feels like there's like a kind of an air of secrecy around the Council of Elders, which I have come to determine is really not the case at all. Yet at the same time, there does need to be a certain level of confidentiality in these discussions, wouldn't you say?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Because sometimes when you're weighing things, what you think about when you're trying to figure out something, with your wife. Part of what's wonderful about having a spouse is having a real confidential counselor that you can talk about things that you feel like, well, if the neighbors heard me asking this question, they'd probably think I was some kind of lunatic. But my wife knows me. She knows where I'm coming from. She's not going to presume, about what I'm bringing up. One of the things I appreciate about talking to those men is I've had time to get to know those men. And so I know the context they're bringing into the discussion. I know I can talk about, for instance, things about the millennium, coming, right? And I know Mr. Greer. I know when I talk about the millennium that there's a way he thinks about that. And I don't have to worry about any kind of misunderstanding. I know I can talk about that in a certain way. And I'm grateful for that. And so it really does help.
You reminded me of one of the quotes that Mr. Weston has in his LCN article from August 2019 LCN, Why a Council of Elders. He has a quote in there from U.S. General George S. Patton, where he says, if everyone is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking.
Yeah, it's exactly, because that's what he's looking for. If he just said, hey, fellas, I think this about this. Do you all also think this about this? We all said in unison, oh, yes, sir, we do. Oh, well, that's great. But if and sometimes that does happen, by the way. In fact, several times, I know in this last meeting, sure enough, it's like, well, there's barely anything to discuss because it was so obvious. Certain things are so obvious. But at the same time, if that happened literally every single time, knowing that we are talking about important things where, when it comes to, I say the mundane things, but the fact is you've got a large worldwide work to run, and there are multiple paths, and it's not clear which is the right way to go. I'm not talking about doctrine. I'm talking about practical matters, where money needs to be spent or what avenues are the wisest ones to pursue. There's nothing in the Bible that tells you this digital platform is better than that digital platform. All there is your praying to God before the meeting, your discussion in the room. And it would be kind of crazy if every single time someone said, well, I think platform B is the one to approach. Oh, absolutely. Like a bunch of Borg, for those that know what that is. No, like Patton said, if that's happening, no one's actually thinking about it. You're kind of counting on the fact that some people are going to suggest something about platform C or platform A that you hadn't thought about. In fact, some people think that thing about platform C is way more important. Someone else says, oh no, this thing about platform A is way more important. That's what makes for profitable discussion. As long as there's a spirit of a desire to reach an agreement and to work together and to be brothers, and thankfully that's what we're blessed with.
Well, as we round out our conversation today, I have one final question, and hopefully this will be a question that'll be an easy one. I was actually curious, with as many men as there are, does at some time or another everyone comment on something?
That's a really good question. If you don't mind me saying more than I need to, which is my want, it's what I normally do. Going way back to days when Dr. Meredith was alive, he would bring it out of you. If you sat too long and didn't say something, it actually happened to me once. I remember sitting there for a while, and I couldn't even tell you what the topic was. All I know is I did have a thought come to mind, but I didn't voice it. I was young, and maybe I wasn't even sure if it was worthwhile or not. So you need to take that time to evaluate. You just want to open your mouth and say every dumb thing. You do want to think about it. You want to try to, the Bible talks about the one who keeps his mouth shut and appears wise. So there's times when you're really evaluating, is this even worthwhile, to talk about this idea? And Dr. Meredith would see it, and he would say, Wally, I can tell on your face you got something on your mind. He would make sure that he brought it out and that you would say something. And I would say that hasn't really changed. It's very much an environment where, honestly, I don't think anyone fears saying something. I think everyone feels very open, and pretty much I think everybody does. There's time when maybe it's a topic you just don't have something to contribute to. There's definitely times when the item under discussion is not something that I have any particular expertise on, and I'm far more interested in hearing what other men have to say. But yes, I would say that over the course of 3 days, everybody contributes something in a helpful way, and no one just kind of sits there and does a crossword puzzle. I would say that yes, absolutely, everybody does contribute.
Well, I can only imagine how intimidating it would be to walk into your first council of elders with, collectively, 200, 300, 400 years of ministerial experience, yeah. And some topic
not in you, but in everybody else,
right,
collectively,
in everybody else, and the first time you speak up to comment, I just can't imagine what that would feel like. That would have to be at least a little intimidating, no matter how.
I do have a story about that, if you don't mind me actually saying it. My very first council meeting, so I guess 2012, whenever it was, I can't exactly remember the year, but there was the challenge of where do I sit, and it's kind of a long table, like you can imagine in the movies, a long boardroom table where everybody sits. And Dr. Meredith's in there, and Mr. Greer's in there, and Mr. Milich. And here I am with my black bag that I always carry around. I was coming in from my local area, and so I go, okay, well, where am I going to sit? And all I remembered at the time, I was thinking of Luke 14. Luke 14, it says, for instance, in verse 8, when you're invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him, and he who invited you and him come and say to you, well, give place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. Instead, it tells you in verse 10 to go seek the lowest place. Well, I thought, it's kind of difficult because I've seen in the movies, the CEO always sits at the head of the table. But the thing is, which head, right? Because there's nothing indicating this is the one where Dr. Meredith was going to sit. So if I went too far on one end, I could literally be putting my stuff right next to him. If I went to the other end to try to avoid that, maybe that's where he was sitting. So I thought to myself, oh, brilliant. I'll just sit in the middle. You kind of probably guess where this is going to come.
Yeah, I can tell.
I'm just going to sit right in the middle, and now I've maximized the probability.
Listen, to me, that makes a lot. That was a good call.
Thank you for saying that makes sense. But it was a terrible decision. Just as I was putting my black bag in the chair, Mr. Greer so mercifully was in the middle of a conversation across the room, and he saw me doing it, and he just I wish our listeners could see me shake my head. He shook his head slowly like, No, that's not where you want to sit it. I was literally putting my stuff in Dr. Meredith's chair.
Mayday, Black Hawk down.
Absolutely. I was putting myself right there. So once I knew, based on that no, I found the place further. And it's funny, the place that I end up finding furthest, I think I've sat there now for more than 10 years.
Wow.
But yeah, it is, you want to get it right, and I was definitely a bit of a nervous guy that first year.
How did everyone fit this year? It was already getting a little bit tight before there were a couple more people.
It was
added.
tight. Mr. Weston has added some people in rotation, which is really great. But we actually had some people that couldn't be there in person. Mr. Greer who's doing well, by the way, for those who is wonderful to see him. He looked fantastic. But he just had, some medical procedures, so he was actually at his office. So we had some people streaming in. Rob Tyler, Mr. Tyler was actually in the middle of a huge regional conference there in the Australasian area. I think they had 60 some odd ministers and deacons there. So that was just the best time for them. And so he poor guy, here he is doing a conference there and then staying up in the dead of night for his time just to be able to participate and be here with us. That was magnificent on his part. So with that combination, we ended up fitting pretty well with a few people streaming and the rest of us around the table.
Mr. Smith, do you mind if I ask one more last question?
I do not mind if you ask one more
Your
last question.
Comment about the space made me wonder how many of the men, because I know Mr. Peter Nathan's always been such a good laptop guy for a long time, how many men bring laptops versus how many are still analog and writing on paper?
Oh, wow. You think I would know. Now I visually want to go around the table. I have a laptop. I've tried to use something like, I've used an iPad before, but I have a laptop. You're absolutely right. Peter Nathan next to me, very laptop-y. He's got his Logos, Bible app open.
Power user.
He is absolutely a power user of that thing. You've got Mr. Weston. Mr. Weston actually always, even before he was running the meetings, he would use a laptop on there at the table. And so the two of us, I think, maybe Mr. Wojcicki, I can't recall. It could be about four. Maybe it's about four of us. And for me, I can't beat a laptop, and I got everything there, my Bible and everything else. In fact, that's actually, at least for me, one of the benefits of having my laptop. And it actually, the last thing I'll say, if you don't mind, it's not a last question, but I can make it a last comment, something I'd add, is one of the things that I love most about the council is, I mentioned at the very beginning that you kind of hope the council is a certain way, when you're praying for the council. And one of those things is exactly what I hoped in the past and that I have gotten to experience now for, it looks like, I guess, more than a decade, which is that the Bible is what matters. That whenever there is a question that comes up, the Bible makes surprise appearances sometimes when you're talking about something and you didn't even think there was a biblical principle applied, and there's a member of the council who happens to say, well, the Apostle Paul said this, or in Deuteronomy it says this. So it's a present in that way. But especially if there's anything that clearly it's people aren't there just to try to figure out what they think about something. You'll see those of us, of course, we open our apps, those who have a computer. There are probably some that use both, but then there's others, their Bibles are out and they're opening those Bibles and you're looking things up. It is exactly the way the church, in my opinion, of course, which I think who would disagree with, it's the way it should be governed by men who want to know what the Bible says, even if the Bible might disagree with them. And, someone will bring up a verse you didn't think about and you're all busy turning to it or scrolling to it or tapping to it to see what it says. And then sure enough, you find out, I didn't even think about that verse. I'm really glad someone brought that up.
Isn't that annoying when your wife does that to you?
To me, I don't know what's worse, when my wife does it to me or when one of my kids does it to me.
I'll be processing things with my wife in the morning because I do my Bible study in the morning. So, getting ready and processing things, and I'll maybe expand on my idea, and then my wife will be quiet, which is always a bad sign. And about 30 seconds later, she'll say, well, except that in such and such a book it says this. And I'm like, oh, you're right. My entire theory shot down in one scripture.
Yeah, and but when it comes to the Council of Elders, that's what you want.
Right.
Is if there's something needs to be shot down by the Bible, you want people there that are going to open that Bible and shoot it down. And
I thought we'd get through a podcast without me mentioning Jordan Peterson, but he said something that was absolutely fascinating one time. because when he was more involved in the university system than he is now, certainly, he would often help students who would do a study. They maybe it was even their thesis for their university. And man, if you actually prove something, it's a pretty big deal, and you're super excited. His advice to them was always run the experiment again, which nobody wanted to do because you already got the result that you wanted. And he said there was he used one in particular as an example, and when they ran it back again, it did not yield the same result, which was naturally frustrating to that individual. But his point was, good. You didn't want to spend the next 20 years of your life researching an idea or a thesis that was actually incorrect.
Right.
And so I hear you say that, and you think, man, we have these ideas, and maybe this is the way it works, and maybe this is where the place of safety is. And then one of the many wise men on the council just says, well, except what about this scripture? And I think, well, okay, I'll waste the rest of my life.
Absolutely.
On a theory that wasn't good.
Absolutely. That's, and to go back to the idea of running the studies, that's what you see corrupting science these days. Is one of the I actually put it in my article on the credibility crisis, is too many people, they see their study validate what they think and they just run with it. Other people, the study disagrees with what they think. Oh, they don't like that, so you reconfigure, you do something else, or it doesn't even get reported. And next thing you know, someone tries to prove it some other way. But yeah, when you're actually dealing with spiritual realities and you're dealing with the truth of God, it's exactly the opposite of the mindset you want to have. You want to have the mindset that, what is it God says, because that's what we want to say.
Since I have the privilege of being invited to the lunches in between meetings, and get to sit down and talk with a number of these men, some of whom I knew before, it's fascinating to me because, naturally whatever you talked about is on their mind to some degree, how serious they are about trying to get it right. And also that they actually care, the idea of, hey, would you please pray, to ask the members to pray for the Council of Elders that we're going to have. And they take that seriously.
Yeah.
I really, you could see their desire to, that's a lot of responsibility to be making some of these decisions or policy even for the church. And you really do. You can tell they want the members praying for them so that God will guide the process in unity and the right just outcome.
Right. Yeah, thank you, because you do feel that weight, and it's a comfort to know that some call went out for people to pray for the Council of Elders, and to know that while some there were times in my past, certainly beforehand, where I might have found Mr. Gwynn might have said, oh, hey, we have council meeting, please pray for that, right. And then he would come back and say, oh, it went well, and I would realize, I didn't pray for that. And then you feel bad, but you also know there are those, and often that's where our widows and such fit in, where they're doing their job on their knees. If we can still bend down, sometimes I worry about where my knees are going, and that they are praying for that, because you absolutely want to know that over the course of that meeting, you're doing your best to understand what it is that God says, and you need all the help you can get. So it is very much appreciated when people pray for the council meetings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Appreciate your expansion and shedding a little light on what goes on in the Council of Elders, and hopefully that will be interesting and edifying for our listeners. Also, listeners, don't forget that if you have some ideas or comments or suggestions or even topics you want discussed, send us an email at podcast@livingyouth.org. Podcast@livingyouth.org.
That would be great. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Robbins, for doing this. It was a lot of fun.
It was fun.
Smith and Robinson.